Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Harmon Museum December Lunch and Learn. I'm John Zimkus, the Education Director and Historian here. We have a lot of things happening in the museum in the next several months, and I thought I'd give you a little heads up on what's going on. This Saturday, Yule time at the Village Town Square. The Village Town Square, the very impressive main floor village of over a dozen shops will be open special for Christmas, 11 to 5. Shops will be open, costume characters will be there, refreshments, gift for the kids. Family of 4 will cost $12, individuals 5, children 17 and down to 4 are $3. So if you have some friends and family who are coming to town this weekend, you might enjoy a little village, a shop at the Village Town Square. Part of your advantage of being here today is that part of the museum is open, so you can take a look at it after the talk and see how nicely it's decorated. On New Year's Eve between 7 and 10, plenty of time to get home, there will be a toast to tomorrow, New Year's Eve party. Stormy Weather Jazz will be performing, dancing with tributes to Duke Ellington. There'll be wine, hors d'oeuvres, champagne toast. $60 individual, $100 for couple, $300 for a table, and it will all benefit the Warren County Historical Society's Harmon Museum. The first Saturdays in flight will begin in January, begin with Saturday, January 3rd. Between 11 and 1, classes are limited to 12 attendees, no age requirement. So you can go with your child, your grandchild, you can all enjoy it together. It'll explore spaceships, planets, various aspects of aviation. Black Bag Bingo will be here in the Conference Center on January 17th. My talk today is Tom Corwin of Profiles in Courage. In our Semendinger Gallery, there is a special display by the same name. So please, after you enjoy your meal and hear the talk, go to the main floor of the Harmon Museum behind me and see the actual artifacts. Many of the pictures you will see on the screen today were actually taken from the vast collection of Tom Corwin material we have here at the Harmon Museum. Music at the museum will begin in February, excuse me. $15 a concert. It's always, for the most part, going to be the second Thursday of each month, beginning in February. Passion Creek Ramblers, Appalachian music will be here between 7 and 8:15. In March, we're not going to be at the Harmon Museum. We're going to be at the Performance Arts Center for the Lebanon High School. And we're going to have, it's a Sunday afternoon, we're going to have the Mason Symphony and the Springboro Wind Symphony, both performing. It is definitely worth your while to see them. They are fantastic. They really are. We are limited here to 130 people. We're going to be limited to about 1,000 at the conference center. Come April, we'll have Gibbons, a duo of violin and cello. Come May, Fintan, Irish band. They have been here several times. We've enjoyed them. And come June, Anna and the Deep Well, contemporary jazz. Now, as I mentioned, they're $15 a concert. But if you buy a series ticket, it's only $50 for all of them. Definitely worth your while. I think you will enjoy that. Speaking of worth your while, at our gift shop, just down the hall here, all items except consignment items for today only are 25% off. So if you're still looking for stocking stuffers or major gifts, take a look at what we have in our gift shop. You will definitely enjoy what you see there. As far as lunch and learns go, we have the next 3 ones are going to be pretty interesting. Come January, Pam Adams will talk about Ormsby McKnight Mitchell. Now, I don't know if you know who that gentleman was. Fort Mitchell, Kentucky is named after him, although they misspelled his last name, by the way. He was quite the Renaissance man. He lived in Lebanon as a young boy up until he went to West Point as a mid-teenager. Stayed at West Point, became a professor of mathematics, left the military, became a engineer for the Warren County, the Little Miami Railway, going through Warren County. Was an instigator in beginning the Cincinnati Observatory. When the Civil War breaks out again, he becomes an officer once again. Well, I'm not filling in the details. And he becomes a general during the Civil War. His nickname was Old Stars, not because of the stars on his shoulder, but because of his appreciation of the stars in the sky. We are so lucky in February to have Abraham Lincoln here. Through the help of John Cooper from Columbus, the president will be here to give a talk and also answer your questions. So that'd be a special event. He'll be here on February 18th, just 6 days after his birthday, so we can help wish him happy birthday. And then on March 18th, we're going to have David Newhart, and he's going to talk about the Warren County Canal. Now, a lot of people don't realize that we actually had a canal here. It didn't last very long, but it left an impact geographically and elsewhere in the area. David is a member of the board of the Ohio Canal Society, so he knows what he's talking about. He'll talk about how it was built and why it didn't last. And if you see a map of the Warren County, of the Ohio canals, if they're worth their salt, there's going to be the little Warren County Canal in that. So if you're not familiar with it or you want more information, please come join us on March 18th. Well, that is all the things coming up. We are now going to enjoy a great meal prepared by Jeanette's. Oh, no, not just yet. Okay, so we'll be back in a little bit with our speaker, who I hope you will enjoy.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining us here. My name is Michael Corwin. I'm the executive director here at the Harmon Museum. Occasionally, they let me out of the office. So I do creep around the building quite frequently. You know, at this time of year, it's something, a lot of tradition is lost. I do have a few Christmas cards coming in. It's expensive anymore to send them. And I wish we could send a Christmas card to all of you and all of our members, but we can't. So today, bear with me. I'm going to give you a bit of a Christmas card. An old chestnut that you all know, but one that I hope you will enjoy. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the wood and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. From the board, the staff, our loyal volunteers, we all wish you the peace of Christmas and a very prosperous 2026. Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed historian and our education director here at the Harmon Museum. In selecting all of the exhibits, John and I were talking about especially the historical exhibits. And I said, you know, we need to touch someone who was noble, who embodied the term statesman and embodied the term honorable. Those things are somewhat antique now when we talk about politics. But we are lucky enough to have a shining example, and we can draw from our archive to tell the story, in part, of a son of Lebanon, the incomparable Thomas Corwin. And to do that, I could think of no one better than the gentleman who frequently interrupts your dinner at the Golden Lamb with wonderful tales of all kinds of historical tidbits, but who is an expert at everything he touches. And I could trust no one better to do this lecture than Mr. John Zimkus.
Well, thank you so very much, Michael, for those kind words. I hope I live up to that introduction. By far the most distinguished individual ever to come out of Warren County in the 19th century, and perhaps numbered among the astonishing people who came out of Ohio in the 19th century, was Thomas Corwin. Born in Bourbon County, Kentucky in 1794, his family moved up to what would someday be Warren County in 1798. His political resume was an impressive one, and it spans all levels of government, local, state, and national. He was prosecuting attorney of Warren County. He was a member of the Ohio General Assembly. He was a U.S. congressman. He was governor of the state of Ohio. He was a United States senator. He was the United States Secretary of the Treasury, and he was President Lincoln's minister to Mexico. Accounts of his political career always refer to his elegance and wit as a public speaker, especially on the campaign trail. He earned the unofficial title of King of the Stump. Former Senator Chauncey Depew in 1922 said, Corwin was probably the most brilliant speaker in the period immediately preceding the Civil War. Henry Clay, who is on the left, and Daniel Webster on the right, who, by the way, both once visited, Clay several times Lebanon, and Webster once. In comparison, Corwin was probably not the statesman they were, but one of his most sharpest critics, W.F.G. Shanks, editor of the Harper's Magazine in 1867, said, in the strictest sense of the term, Corwin was the superior of either in elegance and refinement of style, beauty and richness of imagination, gracefulness of delivery. His uncle was Ichabod Corwin, considered the first settler in what is now Lebanon, in March of 1796. Where he built his cabin was where Berry Intermediate School is today, and also a building where my wife graduated from high school, and I taught school there for some 32 of my 35 years. He was one of the 4 founders of Lebanon and helped map out the first map of Lebanon, which we see here. I have highlighted where the town square is. We are currently right here. His father, Ichabod's older brother, was Matthias Corwin. Tom was one of 9 children born to Matthias and his wife Patience. Before Tom was 5 years old, he had moved in 3 forest homes, 2 in Kentucky and 1 in Ohio. 3 years after the Treaty of Greenville was signed, 2 years after Ichabod, the younger brother of Matthias, moved to what is now Lebanon, Matthias brought his family. Matthias was said to be an honest and fair man. He was one of Warren County's first county commissioners. He was a justice of the peace. He too was a member of the Ohio House, and he eventually served as Speaker of that House. Tom began school at the age of 4 in 1798. His teacher was Francis Dunleavy, a man whose name is known to many people who grew up in this area. He was not only the first teacher in what is now Lebanon, he was the first teacher in what is now the Miami Valley. Tom did not have a long formal education. By the age of 12, he was no longer going to school. His father could only afford one of his sons to go to school, and that would have been Tom's older brother, also named Matthias. His skill as an orator grew when he was barely 12. He performed dialogues published in books. He and his lifelong friend, A.H. Dunleavy, Francis's son, were very much involved in that sort of thing. And A.H. once said that Tom received universal applause for all his oratory skills as a 12-year-old. Josiah Morrow, the premier historian of the Warren County area and Southwest Ohio in the late 19th and early 20th century, in his book, The Life and Speeches of Tom Corwin, said, 3 American statesmen who, without the aid of an academy or college, became most distinguished for their popular elegance were Patrick Henry, Henry Clay, and Thomas Corwin. Among Corwin's early chores was taking wagon loads of produce from Lebanon to market in Cincinnati. He did this as a teenager. And in the beginning years of the War of 1812, he brought needed supplies to American troops to General William Henry Harrison in what was referred to as the St. Mary's country in northwest Ohio. Because of his skill, he got the nickname Wagon Boy. It's a moniker that he would hold for the rest of his political career. An injury to his knee stopped him from working, and he spent the time recuperating, reading books. And he read everything he could get his hand on. He was always engaged in some book or subject. This continued a habit through the rest of his early life. In 1815, at the age of 21, he began studying law with Joshua Collette, the first lawyer in Lebanon. And by May of 1817, he was admitted to the bar and began his law practice. He became well known as an able attorney, his distinction due more so to his gifted public speaking rather than his legal brilliance. The man. He was said to be 5'10", rather above usual size, it says. A large frame and later years are rather heavy. His head was said to be finely shaped. Hair and eyes were black, hair parted, and comb sweeping generously over the head. His eyes were piercing. Complexion, unusually dark, and he actually was referred to as the blackest white man in the United States. Once when speaking to an open air area, someone raised an umbrella and put it over his head. Said, "Do you think the sun will spoil my complexion?" he said. E.D. Mansfield, an author who actually lived in Warren County for a number of years, said there was something in Corwin's appearance to attract a second look from a stranger. He was impressive and full of dignity. Kindliness and benevolence shone out of his eyes and face, countenance pleasing rather than handsome. He was often said to be the best dressed man in court, wearing black pigeon-tailed coats, vest often of velvet, around his neck a wide closed fitted cravat, shirt ruffled in front. It often was remarked that he shaved every day, which was not the common practice back in those days. On November 13th of 1822, in front of the mirror in the fireplace of the main parlor of Tom and Sarah Corwin were married in her brother's house, Phineas Ross's house, which was built in 1818, and it is now 210 West Main Street. In 1855, in that same spot, Tom and Sarah's daughter, Evelina, married George Sage. And then in 1883, at that same spot, Thomas's granddaughter, Carrie Sage, met James Madison Burns. The house was owned by Phineas Ross. He was an early banker in Warren County. He got into financial difficulty, and in 1833, there was a sheriff's sale of the house. The person who bought it was Tom Corwin. He did not move into it. Phineas and his family continued to live there. Some 6 years later, Phineas passed away, and it was shortly after that that Tom and Sarah turned that into their home, and it is known today as the Corwin House. Tom and Sarah had 5 children. Catherine, born in 1827. William Henry Harrison Corwin, born in 1829. Evelina, often called Eva, 1831. Maria Louisa, born in 1834. And Caroline Ross, known as Carrie, 1836. The chief characteristics of Tom Corwin's speeches were a highly developed extemporaneous style. He could speak at the moment with very little preparation, and it said he did not have copious notes. He did not write the speech down. A heavy reliance on humor and very dramatic and forceful delivery. Perhaps no orator, not of the pulpit, ever drew more frequently illustrations from the Bible, it was said of Tom Corwin. He was a constant reader of the Bible. A.H. Dunleavy said, as when we were law students, he and Corwin would repeat to each other poems they admired and had committed to memory. There were always some quotation from the Bible, some poetry, some prose, some geographic area, some reference to law passed that Corwin would quote. He had a marvelous and a sense of humor. A contemporary librarian of Congress said, great as Corwin's power of humor, they were always kept subordinate to the aim and convincing his audience. To those who, misled by popular rumor of his facetious qualities, expected to hear only the gesture, the grave earnestness and frequent solemnity of his appeal came in the nature of a surprise. The editor of the Herald newspaper in 1844 wrote, few men had the ability that Tom Corwin had to instruct at the same time as to please a popular assembly. And as you see here, William Dean Hall said, Tom Corwin could put a principle of reason in form of a jest that would go farther than even eloquence would carry it with the whimsical Western people. He knew that the horse laugh was just as important as horse sense. Most of his humor was natural and spontaneous, growing out of the immediate situation. It is said in 1821, when he was a member of the Ohio House, a gentleman was proposing there was a bill before the General Assembly to outlaw public whipping in Ohio. A member who was from Connecticut said he was opposed to that bill. And he says that back in his old state, whipping was, and people would immediately leave Connecticut after they were whipped, and it was good for the state of Connecticut. Corwin rose and said, I knew a great many people who came to Ohio from Connecticut, but I have never before known the reason for their coming. His voice and manner, he was said to have a cello voice, mellow musical qualities. Rufus Coates, a lawyer and orator himself, once said he never spoke with whimsiness enough to have his voice lose its melody and sweetness. Fill the cup of your eyes with the tears, and a single sentence is what Corwin can do. Shanks once again wrote, never had a speaker more complete control over his voice or voice power over an audience. He was soft, round, soft, flexible. Within the scope of a few brief sentences, it would often expand from the lowest conversational and confidential tone to a climax which would startle his hearers in the remotest of galleries. Also was his facial expressions. It was said he had the most remarkable facial expressions of the order of his time. Senator Charles Sumner, famous senator from Massachusetts at that time, remarked about Corwin's rare dramatic faculty. He was often compared to some of the actors and comedians of the time. Here, one person once complained that to read a Corwin speech was sometimes disappointing. The words of the speech were unlike what came from his lips, as the remainder of a bottle of champagne after standing a week is unlike the sparkling beverage when it was first uncorked. But it was part of him. There is a local story. He's at the East Baptist Church. Now, of course, the First Baptist Church, which is now part of the Leatherman Christian School, faces Warren Street. The original church was where Fifth Third Bank is and faced Broadway. There was a time where Reverend Finley, John Finley, was preaching. Corwin and his family were sitting in what was referred to as the Amen section, which was behind the pulpit. And the preacher started complaining about actions that Corwin had done as a politician. Corwin found himself unable to defend himself because he was in church. So the only thing he had was his facial expressions. His only weapon of resistance was defense was his face, strengthened occasionally by a movement of the head. The attention of the congregation soon was fixed on each verbal volley from the pulpit was blocked in the pew behind him with mute elegance. The war lasted for a good part of the service and provided some rare entertainment on that Sunday afternoon. Like Abraham Lincoln, Corwin used self-deprecating humor. Lincoln was accused of being two-faced, said, if I were two-faced, would I use this face? Corwin, politically incorrect by today's standards, often remarked about his dark complexion. It was an issue. At one time, many of Corwin's anecdotes often appeared in Harper's Weekly, in the Atlantic Monthly, and what have you. There was a time where a visiting dignitary from England was in Washington, and Tom Corwin was with some people greeting him. And then the dignitary turned to a senator nearby and asked, is his tribe friendly with the whites? He was, in fact, and I first heard this when I was working on my master's almost 50 years ago, that he was arrested for being an escaped slave. And the professor, Carl Becker, the head of the history department at Wright State, told me that this occurred. The article was in Scientific American magazine. I finally found that article. Apparently it was all in magazines and newspapers all across the country. I found it in the Voice of Industry from Pittsburgh, Massachusetts on September 4th, 1845. The Cincinnati Herald on the 15th instant says that ex-Governor Corwin who has a very swarthy complexion, while traveling about 15 miles from this place, was seized by a party of armed men who rushed out of the woods, swearing that he was a colored man, They tried and bore him to jail as a runaway slave. Carl Sandburg, in his book on Lincoln, actually said Tom Corwin was the best wit in Washington. This gentleman here, William Scholler, knew both men, and he compared Corwin's humor to that of Lincoln's. Corwin's was different. Lincoln collected stories. Corwin had them spontaneously appear as he was talking. In 1840, Tom Corwin was elected governor of Ohio. He had served 5 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. He had very little power as governor. He once quipped that all he could do was pardon prisoners and appoint notary publics. It wasn't even a place for the governor to live. So when session was done, he came back to Lebanon. He was a member of the Whig Party. The following year, 1841, both houses of the General Assembly were taken over by the Democrats. And he tried to run for re-election in 1844. It was only a 2-year term. And he lost for his one and only time at the polls for re-election as governor of Ohio. On November 7th of 1843, he was part of the committee welcoming former President John Quincy Adams to Lebanon. The reception was at the First Baptist Church, or the East Baptist Church. This is an 1852 map, and this is the church, as I was telling you, facing Broadway. Today, the church is over here. Corwin, in a most eloquent way, say, "My neighbor citizens of this town and the surrounding country have devolved on me the very agreeable duty of greeting your arrival amongst them. Be assured, sir, that your fame is cherished with the same sincerity in the small village as it has been in your home of Quincy. Your character as a scholar, an orator, a statesman, and a patriot in regards with as much veneration in the Miami Valley as that can be found on the banks of the Merrimack River. My humble but welcome task is performed when, on behalf of these friends and neighbors, I bid you welcome to the West, welcome to Ohio, welcome to this village, welcome to these people, welcome to the best affection of their hearts." John Quincy Adams, speaking, said, "I must confess my friend's address has deeply affected me. To that gentleman's voice in the halls of the national legislature in the past years, I have been accustomed ever to listen with pleasure, and had been constrained to love and admire him, not less for the qualities of his heart than the strength and vigor of his mind. And when he was called from that seat of Congress to be governor of this great state, I could hardly determine which feeling was more prominent in my bosom, the joy of his elevation or regret of the loss of his elegance in debate and wisdom in council in our National Assembly." A point I should make is that John Quincy Adams was a member of Congress at that time. He was elected to Congress 9 times after he was President of the United States. So he would have heard Tom Corwin many, many times. In 1844, Corwin was sent to the United States Senate. It is here he gave his most famous and most courageous speech. Texas, which was an independent country from 1836 to 1845, wanted to become part of the United States. And American troops were down there. Texas said its border with Mexico was the Rio Grande. Mexico said no, it was the Nueces River. There were troops, American troops sent down that way, and they were fired upon. there was a bill appearing before Congress to pay for the troops. War was never declared. They simply voted that it existed. And he received a letter from a gentleman whose son was down there. And the son, who was an officer, wrote, "Right in the enemy's country, the people were leaving their homes as the American troops approached." From Corwin's point of view, is this American territory or is this Mexican territory? The people are fleeing when the Americans come. Corwin, in his speech, and he spoke for 2.5 hours, and it wasn't meant to be humorous at all. "What is the territory, President Polk, which you propose to wrest from Mexico? His Bunker Hills and Saratogas and Yorktowns are there." He predicted a war over slavery because of the conquest of this war. A single acre of Mexican land is taken, the North and South are brought into a collision on the point where neither will yield. The senator from Michigan, he says we want room. If I were a Mexican, I would tell him, "Have you not room in your own country to bury your dead? If you come to mine, I will greet you with bloody hands and welcome you to hospitable graves." At the conclusion, he said, "Show Mexico that you are sincere when you say you have desire nothing by conquest." We got quite a bit by conquest. Fighting over the border of Texas, the United States took 1/3 of Mexico and made it its territory. So we're talking about California and parts of 6 other states today. The Ohio State Journal in May 27th of 1847 said that Corwin's speech was an earnest and impassioned advocacy from what he believed to be right against the odds and in face of all opposition. That's where the courage came from. He knew people would not agree with him. He knew that the war existed and money would be spent, but he thought he had to speak against it. Someone else who thought that was wrong was Abraham Lincoln and his one and only term in Congress. For a while, Corwin was the darling of the Whig Party. We actually have this small poster in our Tom Corwin Profiles in Courage display. And it has Corwin. You can see the Capitol back there. We have a little wagon boy symbol there. But it's hard to read here, but it does say Thomas Corwin, 12th President of the United States. So he was briefly considered a presidential candidate. He sort of fell to the wayside when Zachary Taylor, the hero of the Mexican-American War, threw his hat in the ring. Now, for many a Democrat, he was a villain. He was a traitor. I actually got this poster some 40 years ago at the Ohio History Center in downtown Columbus. They had does the Ohio Village still exist there? Okay, well, in the print shop, they reproduced this. And it's a copy of an actual meeting which took place in Lebanon. The meeting took place on the 22nd of July in 1848. Honorable Alex Duncan was a doctor, and he was a former congressman, will be present and address a dramatic mass meeting at Lebanon on behalf of Cass Butler Weller and democracy, and will give an expose of Taylorism, Haleism, Van Bolterism, and the rest of the anti-American and anti-republicanism of the day. And Thomas Corwin licking the Mexican blood from the sword of General Zachary Taylor. Let every man who has an American heart be present to hear his country defended against the vile aspirations of black federalism. Black federalism is the idea of freeing the slaves. In 1965, the very last episode of a highly acclaimed TV series, Profiles in Courage, based on John F. Kennedy's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, aired. The topic was Thomas Corwin. George Rose, an English actor, played Corwin. Rose had won 2 Tony Awards for Broadway acting. It was not in the original book, but it was approved by President Kennedy when they were planning the series before his assassination. So it is a story he would have, he gave his consent to. In 1850, he became a Secretary of the Treasury. President Millard Fillmore appointed him to that position. And this is the only time his wife, Sarah, moved to Washington. All the other times she was back home in Lebanon with the kids. But now, and they live in the Blair House, the somewhat famous Blair House, where dignitaries and the president-elect stays before the inauguration. So here we have a picture of the Blair House, the White House, and the location of the Blair House. Corwin had a terrible head for finance. There are stories about people coming after him because of bills he owed. And one man asked for a promissory note. Corwin took out a pencil or pen and wrote his name on it, and is said to have remarked, "Thank God, another debt paid." And it was simply promising to pay it later. His cousin, Robert Corwin, youngest son of Ichabod, often remarked how poor he was in that. Corwin was said to be the only person who was given, while reading a letter that he should run for president, was looking over his shoulder to see if debt collectors were coming after him. So he does become Secretary of the Treasury, but he surprised a number of people as to how efficient he was. The Baltimore Clipper newspaper in 1850 gave notice that there were neither bar nor bolts on the doors of Corwin's office, and that as a public servant, he would always be found accessible. After leaving that office, he would be elected to Congress 2 more times, this time as a Republican, a party which began in 1854 and in 1856 had its first person running for president. Corwin's career was on the downward trend. He wasn't as highly respected as he once was. Those who were former Democrats still would not forgive him for his stand against the Mexican War. The idealists in the Republican Party referred to him as a practical politician who moved to the Republican Party reluctantly. The radicals feared him as a, quote, fossil Whig, having influence on Lincoln, and doubted Lincoln's ability to resist the old men, which included Corwin. The radicals were also not pleased with what was known as the Corwin Amendment. In 1841, on January 14th in 1861, a special 33-man committee, one from each state, was formed together. It was an attempt to stop any potential civil war from happening. Corwin was the head of that committee. The committee proposal read, "No amendment shall be made to the Constitution will so authorize or give Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institution thereof, including that persons held in labor or service by the laws of the state. In other words, slavery would be legal. Now, for a lot of people today, they can't put their head around. A man from Ohio was going to save slavery. It's important not to look at the past with a 21st century mindset. It's not to look at the past knowing the outcome already. David McCullough, my favorite historian, once said in a speech in Rhode Island in 2001, nobody ever lived in the past. These people might be said aren't aspects of the past. There is no such thing as the past. It was the present, their present, not our present. Their present we have to understand. We have to take in consideration, for example, all the things they had to contend with that we don't have to think about. All the inconveniences, all the discomforts, and all the fears. The fear that the United States would cease to exist. That was the thought behind what is known as the Corwin Amendment. They first met in December of 1860. Shortly after their first meeting, South Carolina leaves the Union. Shortly after that, Florida, Mississippi, and Alabama all do that. So it was an effort which really didn't have any chance at all. Corwin writes President-elect Lincoln on January 14th of 1861. It's a letter which on the outside says, "For Lincoln eyes only." And Corwin writes, "If the states are no more harmonious in their feelings and opinions than these 33 representative men, then appalling as they are may be, we must dissolve, and long the bloody Civil War must follow. I cannot comprehend the madness of the times. Southern men are theoretically crazy. Extreme Northern men are practical fools. The latter are really quite as mad as the former. Treason is in the air around us everywhere. It goes by the name patriotism. Men in Congress boldly avow it, and public officers are full of acknowledged secessionists. God alone, I fear, can help us. 4 or 5 states are gone. Others are driving before the gale. I have looked at this horrid picture till I have been able to gaze at it with perfect calmness. I think if you live, you may take the oath." He was thinking of the possible assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He campaigned for Lincoln through much of the summer of 1860 and the winter, fall of 1860. In the first week or so of the Lincoln administration, he visited the White House. There was, who can we send to Mexico to help represent the United States? And Corwin was asked to help come up with names. And the name they finally came up with was Thomas Corwin. He was named U.S. Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary to Mexico. It's a fancy title, Minister to Mexico, or if you prefer, Ambassador. It was considered by many to be the most important diplomatic post. Horace Greeley, a Democrat and in a few years a presidential candidate, said, "In the present crisis, the mission to Mexico may well become the most important of all our foreign relations. And it is fortunate that so able and skillful a statesman as Mr. Corwin has been selected the responsible task of counteracting in that quarter the filibustering projects of the Southern Confederacy. On April 11th, 1861, Corwin is in New York City. This is the day before Fort Sumter is attacked, so this is a day before the beginning of the Civil War. With him is his 22-year-old son, William Henry Corwin. Corwin writes a frantic letter to his mother, Henry does, William Henry. And he says, "We sail tomorrow. Pa is out of patience because I did not get the daguerreotypes of all the family before we left. Get your portrait painted at once. Goodbye, dear mother, your son, W.H. Corwin." Lincoln's instructions were to combat the Confederate influence, to block Confederate attempts to have diplomatic recognition from Mexico, and to stop supplies going to the Confederate States over the Rio Grande. At the same time, Mexico had its issues. The person he dealt with most was Benito Juarez, president of the Mexican Republic. Shortly after, Corwin was actually there for about 3 years. Napoleon III took Archduke Maximilian von Habsburg and asked, "Would you like to be the Emperor of Mexico?" So French troops with von Habsburg was he was a pawn in all this. He was a good man, but naive. He was sent to Mexico, and he was established as emperor. So these two men constantly were at odds, and toward the latter part of our Civil War, their Civil War began. Corwin tried to only deal with him, and when he came to power in early 1864, Corwin tried to have little of anything to do with him and actually left Mexico before the fighting really began. The French pulled back their forces, and eventually the emperor was left by himself with some loyal Mexicans, and he was executed. And Benito Juarez was once again president of Mexico. After our Civil War, we were able to help them. We gave them loans and what have you. Corwin, when he left in May of 1864, thought he wasn't successful. But Confederate Brigadier General Hamilton B. wrote, "Through the influence of Mr. Corwin, the tone of the Juarez government has been hostile to our cause, and at his dictation, various measures have been initiated calculated to annoy and injure us. They have finally decreed martial law on the frontier and forbid the export or import of any article whatever from Texas." The last duty that Corwin ever performed for his president, Abraham Lincoln, was serving as one of the 22 pallbearers at his funeral in Washington, D.C. 6 were chosen from the Senate. 6 were chosen from the House. 3 were chosen from the Army, including Lieutenant General Ulysses Simpson Grant. 3 were chosen from the Navy. And 4 were civilians, including Thomas Corwin. It is around this time, and perhaps a little bit earlier, that Corwin was filled with regrets. Despite his very successful political career, he thought himself a failure. And the main reason he thought himself a failure was his love of humor. He told many a person, for God's sake, never cultivate the reputation of being a wit. When he saw a young speaker, Don Piatt, the person he supposedly saw, you can find a lot of different people he supposedly told this to, but I'm quite sure it was Don Piatt. You may be familiar with the Piatt castles. He saw him joking with the audience, and he said, "Don't do it, my boy. You should remember the crowd always looks up to the ringmaster and down on the clown. It resents that which amuses. The clown is the more clever of the fellow of the two, but he is despised. If you would succeed in life, you must be solemn, solemn as an ass. All great monuments on earth have been built over solemn asses." So even in telling this man not to be funny, he was funny. A 160 years ago yesterday, Corwin was invited to a party at the home of James C. Whitmore at 250 F Street in Washington. Now, the best I can figure out, this is about a half a mile from the Capitol and about a mile and a half from the White House. Whitmore was a military agent from Ohio. And Ohio governmental and Ohio military, there were members of the Supreme Court, there were generals, there were senators, and they were all gathered at this house. This is a picture of F Street. Where it is in reality compared to where that house at 250 is, I don't know. But this is 1860, so this is what part of F Street would have looked like. Two people waiting for him to come that night were two young congressmen. Rutherford B. Hayes, who was 43 years old, and General James A. Garfield, who was only 34. Garfield was a general. It was Lincoln who in 1863 suggested, although in the military, he run for Congress. And so he kept the name general for quite a while. Both these people had strong recollections of Tom Corwin that night. It was a night you would not forget. In his diary, Hayes wrote December 16, 1865. Last night, a very pleasant meeting of Ohio men at Mr. James C. Whitmore's. Chief Justices Chase, both senators, Judge Swain, many representatives, General Gilmore, Tom Corwin. A very happy time. Governor Corwin, happy, genial, full of humor. I saw him standing at some distance from when I was comfortably seated. I went to him, conducted him to my seat. He was happy, genial, and humorous as ever. Late the evening, he was struck with paralysis on the right side, soon became unconscious and must die. So disappears the finest genius Ohio has ever produced without an equal as popular orator in this country. 30 years later, in 1893, or almost 30 years later, a reporter asked him about Corwin, and this is what Hayes said at that time. When Corwin was in the midst of jesting, Ohio Senator Benjamin Wade, who had been listening intently, suddenly asked, "Those Mexicans want to annex the United States. What do you think of that?" Corwin's face has changed from gay to grave. His eyes became serious, and everyone bent forward to hear what he might say. He raised his hand and attempted to speak. His lips moved, but no word came out. His hand still moved in gesture. Then it was seen that something was the matter, and we moved back to give him air. He raised himself suddenly from his seat, reached forward his hands, and fell into the arms of friends. We carried him to the next room, laid him on a bed. He never spoke again. James A. Garfield wrote in 1878, A large party of Ohio men had assembled in the house of Mr. Wetmer, the military agent of Ohio. Corwin was in his happiest vein of antidote. He occupied the sofa with a friend seated on each hand, and many seated in front of him, as could get within reach. They were listening to one of his inimitable stories, and the source of which he rose, illustrating some point of an antidote, and while making a gesture with both hands, was stricken with paralysis and fell forward. I caught him in my arms, and Whitlaw Reid, who later on became U.S. ambassador to both France and England, and a graduate of Miami University, and there's a Reed Hall named after him over there, stood behind me. They aided in carrying him to his bed in the adjoining room. He spoke only once or twice on the way, and as we laid him down, never spoke again. He died in that house 2 days later, 160 years ago tomorrow. An eyewitness who spoke in length to the Ohio State Journal newspaper, but kept his name anonymous. Josiah Morrow said it was Representative Samuel Schellebarger, but most sources do not give the name. Recalls that night, but the part I want to read to you is before the attack. In 10 minutes after he had entered the room, I saw from a distance men collecting and compacted around him. Some were seated by him, some stood erected by his chair, some leaned and pressed eagerly forward between the more inner circles of listeners, pushed their ears forward to hear the words and whispers which came from the center figure of the circle. Some sat, some stood, some kneeled, all leaned forward to listen. His youth, with its inimitable charm and grace, seemed for a moment to have come back to him. There were once more the flow of humor, the sparkle of merriment, the glow of enthusiasm, the flash of wit, and the charm of anecdote and illustration. And there his wondrous play features which made him Corwin. Men came repeatedly out from his presence at that seat that night, exclaiming, "There is but one Corwin." The following day, there was a tribute to him in the Capitol, many Capitol Senate chambers. Many people spoke. Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase, former governor of Ohio, said, "Great were his titles and honors won at the bar and in the legislative halls and in the executive councils, but at this moment they seem insignificant in comparison with the admiration, love, and veneration which gathered around him as a man. Let others call him senator, secretary, and minister. Let us call him man, our friend." His Washington funeral took place on the 20th of December, the following day. It was in the house of Wetmore. Funeral ceremonies, according to newspaper accounts, were held in the afternoon. During the early part of the day, large numbers of people were gathered to have a last look at the features of the dead. The body was laid in a handsome coffin of black walnut, covered with black cloth, trimmed with silver, and lined inside with white satin, and was placed in the center of one of the upper rooms. The time of the commencement of service was 3:30 p.m. At 3 o'clock, restriction to who would see the casket was for members of Congress, from family members and personal friends. Seated by the coffin were relatives of the dead. His daughter, Miss Louisa Corwin, his son-in-law, George Sage, and Mrs. Smith of Baltimore, cousin of Mrs. Corwin, and her son and daughters. The undertaker was making a move toward the coffin, but at that moment, according to the newspaper accounts, a petite female, Louisa Corwin, deep mourning, glid her hand gently to touch the cold hand of her father. Tears fell fast from overflowing eyes. And what tears? Tears wrung with the depth of a daughter's heart. Hot tears, warm at the fire of holiness affection, a daughter's love. The sorrowing daughter was kindly removed from the apartment and the lid closed. Policemen assigned for the duty took up the casket containing the honored dust, bore it down the street, and placed it upon the waiting hearse. Mourners followed and entered in their carriages. The sad procession moved slowly toward the railroad station at 4:15. Passing by the door on the ground level, newspaper accounts said, noticed a colored girl, a servant from whose head was covered with a wrapped handkerchief, standing, hiding her face in her hands, sobbing as if her heart would break. The Western Star, in repeating this article, which came from a Washington newspaper, said the colored girl alluded to was a former slave in Washington City. 15 years ago, she was about to be sent south. She was the wife of Governor Corwin's body servant. The governor bought her from her master, paid full price for her, and gave her her freedom. The committee to attend the remains back to Lebanon included Rutherford B. Hayes, General Garfield, and Samuel Shellabarger, the man Josiah Morrow said wrote that unacclaimed article. The 16 pallbearers included Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase of the Supreme Court, Supreme Court Justice Noah Swan, William H. Seward, Secretary of the State, the Mayor of Washington, Radical Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, and once again, Lieutenant General Ulysses Simpson Grant. The funeral in Lebanon took place on Friday, December 22nd. The remains, accompanied by a large procession of citizens, were taken from the house. He lie in state in the library of the Corwin house, which would have been this room right here, the left-hand corner room. They were visited by a large number of people from town and around surrounding country. The oval silver plate on the coffin lid bore Thomas Corwin, born July 29, 1794, died December 18, 1865. The procession to the brand new East Baptist Church was the Masonic Order. Corwin was the Grand Master in 1828. Mourning carriages, pallbearers, the hearse mall pallbearers, members of the deceased in the carriage, members of the bar, and then mourners. Among the 8 pallbearers were A.G. McBurney, Lieutenant Governor of the state, and A.H. Dunleavy, his childhood friend. The procession was then moved to the Lebanon Cemetery, and the coffin was placed in a crypt for future interment. Now, this thing we may know as a crypt wasn't built until 1899, but there was an earlier one somewhere in the cemetery, and that is where the body was stored. What they were waiting for was Corwin's son to come back from Mexico. William Henry Harrison Corwin was the charge d'affaires in Mexico. He stayed in Mexico for another 2 years. He was educated at Granville College, now Denison University. After coming back in 1866, he went back to school and he became a doctor and was a medical practitioner here in Lebanon until his death in 1880. An unsigned article, which was written by A.H. Dunleavy, wrote on that last day, the last remains of Corwin were committed to the grave on Tuesday, the 12th instant, in the presence of a large collection of his relatives and friends. The body had been embalmed and preserved in a vault in the cemetery to wait the arrival of his only son, W.H. Corwin, who had been in Mexico with his father since the spring of 1861. The son arrived in Lebanon on Tuesday preceding the final burial and had the melancholy satisfaction of being present with the family and relatives when his body of his venerable father was committed to a final resting place. To him who pens this short notice, he's writing about himself, the scene awakened afresh an association of a whole lifetime. Some 68 years before, he first met the deceased in a school located 100 yards from this spot where the remains of this honored companion was then being disposed for its final resting place. And from the early of their lives of his deceased, they had almost constant companions in social friendship, educational and professional pursuits. Their association and at the very spot had commenced more than 80 years before and had never been interrupted by the slightest discord. There was an individual little stone with his initials put on it, and there was a large marker which had he and eventually his wife Sarah's markers on it. On July 29th, 1961, a new marker was placed there. Which one are you? On the right? Okay. This marker was established by the Ohio Monument Builders, dignitaries from the Sons of the American Revolution, the Warren County Historical Society, Ohio Monument Builders, the Lebanon's Lodge of Masons, Chamber of Commerce, quite a few. Two of his great-great-granddaughters, one of which is with us today, unveiled the marker. There was a program for it. On the west side, when you look at it by facing east, you had the seal of Lebanon and the birth and death dates of Tom and Sarah Corwin. On the east side, which you read by facing west, you have the Ohio seal and the impressive list of political offices held by Thomas Corwin. In 1899, an orator and writer named Robert Ingersoll visited Thomas Corwin's grave, and he wrote, "In his laughter there was logic, in his wit wisdom, in his honor, his humor, philosophy, and philanthropy. He was a supreme artist. He painted pictures with words. He knew the strength and velocity of verbs, the color, the light, and shades of adjectives. He was a sculptor in speech, changing stones to statues. He was natural, and he had a spontaneity of winds and waves. He was the greatest orator of his time, the grandest that ever stood beneath our flag." Thank you. If you have any questions, I will do my best at answering them. If not, I hope you take advantage of the 25% off at our gift shop. I hope you have a great Christmas, and thank you for being here. Go up to the main floor of the Harmon Museum and in the Seminary Gallery and see the display on Corwin and many of the artifacts I talked about in this talk. Thanks for sharing this day with us, and hope to see you next year.